ancient, or should I say the early apostolic fathers, and also a lot of the saints of the church. So I don't know how many of them that you know, but the most important individuals in the church truly were black people. St. Augustine, who actually came from Tagaste, Numidia, was taught by St. Ambrose, the major bishop of that area. He right now, I have an article that Pope John Paul calls him the common father of Christendom. He calls him the common father of Christendom, St. Augustine. They call him the thinking machine of theology. He was the individual that laid the foundation for the interpretation specifically of this metaphorical concept. And that's, that's post to individuals like Paul, who is another very funny character. But when I began to study, I began to find some really, really strange things. Because when I was in catechism and involved in Christianity, I began to find out that a lot of the material just didn't hold water the way that I assumed that it really did. Eventually, my family dropped Christianity. They became Muslims, followers of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and I went that route, and I studied a lot of that material. I had my relationship with the Nation of the 5%ers. I probably was around them for more than 15, 20 years. And then I happened to be moved by this gentleman that I told you about, Professor George E. Simmons, who was the individual who actually moved me to, or spurred me to, go into the area of looking in more detail about history. But to go on, I began to read the Bible and began to find out that something ain't right, something is not right. Because I began to look at the material literally the way that I got it. And I began to find out that the material just did not hold water logically. Logically, there are things that you begin to look at, and I began to try to break down, and I just didn't come to grips with what that really meant. One of the things that I began to find out is the dating process of the Bible. I don't know how many people know the dating process of the Bible. Anybody ever had a Bible with dates? Somebody should raise their hand. Okay, I knew he would raise his hand. But you'll find out that there are certain Bibles that do have dates. I didn't happen to bring mine today, but I do bring a piece of paper that comes out of the first page of the Bible. As a matter of fact, I think I got this from you, Baba Cinder, quite a number of years ago. But one thing I began to find out is the dates did not add up. They just did not add up. And one of the dates that were used in various points. The Eastern Orthodox Church in the 17th century said that the earliest date of creation was 5508. 5508. And they said that that was the earliest date in regard to the development of the Christian, or should I say, the earliest Christian, the Greek Orthodox perspective of the earliest date of creation, 5508. Then you had the Syriac, or the Syrian Christians, who said that the date was 4790. 4790. Now, a lot of this material that I'm going to be quoting comes from a book called The Chronological History of Humankind. I mean, the chronological history of the chronological prehistory all the way up into present-day history. It's like a big dictionary of dates and events. The next date was done by Archbishop Usher and Cambridge, University out of Europe, and that was 4004 BC. And then you also have the date that was used by the Jewish or the Hebrew community that actually came out to 3740, which actually comes out today to 5754. That's what the date that they particularly used. I think I have just 1 second. Because you have to understand that a lot of the dates actually are numbers that individuals either grabbed out of the air or that they use a particular date to coincide with the events that were already written. This is Star Ledger, Friday, September 17th, and it says, a blessed, happy 5,754. That's the earliest date that you'll find that a lot of them use. I'm talking about Hebrews now. Let me read a date to you that comes from Archbishop Usher. Okay, let's see now. And these dates, again, are not dates that are based on facts. They're based on man's perspective of how they began to deal with it. This is Archbishop Usher. Let me read. It says, this work, creation, took place, and man was created by the Trinity on October 23rd, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning. Should I read that again? 9 o'clock in the morning. And I always, you know, as John G. Jackson said, I wonder what was going on at 8 o'clock. But that's 4004 BC. This page here identifies, as you can see, it says the first books of Moses, called Genesis. And one thing that you find different about this page is that right here in the right-hand corner, it says 4004 BC. And I'm pretty sure that very few of you have seen a Bible that has dates in it. And this identifies some of the earliest concepts. So you really want to take into consideration how these dating processes came up. And I want to say this also is that this particular discourse is not, you know, bent on bashing at Christians or Jews or Muslims. It's just trying to give some information or clarity to where and how this material developed. Whether we look at it from a mythological, an allegorical, a traditional, or folkloric, we're just trying to clarify the material. The contents is not of my concern. It's how it developed that is my concern. Because we can all develop and benefit from principles, because these books are nothing but principles that govern and regulate man's conduct and behavior in his relationship with his fellow man, in his relationship with environment, but most of all, his personal communication with the unknown, or what we call God. That's all of what any book does, any religious book. Quran, Bible, Torah, Popin Vuh, Bobbin Gator. I mean, you name them. I read quite a few of them, and I'm telling you that all of them deal with these concepts. They're rooted in principles in being able to regulate your relationships and how you conduct yourself as an upright, righteous individual. But I started looking and I started finding out some real strange things. First of all, the Bible was not a book that was written for the common individual to be read. It was never written for us to read. It was only written really for the priesthood to read, because they were codified and schooled in how to interpret and how to define the material, because a lot of it, as I said, was exoteric or esoteric. Esoteric meaning hidden or in a very spiritual nature, and exoteric meaning literal or very physical. And what happened is that there are some events in this book that are written as poetry, as mythology, as allegory, as folklore, as tradition, and as history. And it's important that you know how to decipher, how to break down, how to sift out what is what, so that you can benefit from that experience. But you'll find out as the more and more you begin to study, the broader your understanding becomes on how to interpret the material. So what I'm going to do today is try to break down some of the distortions, but most of all, to open up some of the complications that have been we have been subjected to from what the Professor Simmons would call the pork chop chicken eating preachers have been giving us. And the reason I say that because religion also was used as a tool for political profitable gain, and one of the strongest tools that have been used then and now. More people died from religion than all the crack cocaine and all the alcohol and all the other wars that we could have had. You'll find out that religion was at the base of a lot of it. And I don't like to use religion in the context of it's just as an ideology. I'm talking about the practitioners of the religion. So we make clear, so you know how people say, I don't be beating up on my religion. Well, it's not about that, because there are individuals in every religion that you can look at and they are genuine and germane and they have a good attitude about helping you and things like that. But there's quite a few individuals that's out to get you through. So when I began to look at this book, I said, wow, how should I address it? And I began to read books by religious authors, but first by guys that Professor Simmons schooled me to, and Dr. Ben, The Chronology of the Bible, which is a quite old book by Dr. Ben, a small pamphlet, but it gives you some basic material on the compilation of the Bible. And I began to look at how this book was written. One thing that I found out from the very beginning is that out of the books that were written, let's take the 39 books, the Christian concept of the Bible, the 39 books that are in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, they said out of them 39, 27 of them you cannot, this is in theology school and in seminaries, 27 of them books out of 39 that you cannot find the author for. The author is anonymous. That's not to say that there's somebody's name on them, because there's a lot of individuals who are given the attributed contribution as being the writer of a book, but you'll find out that when you do serious evaluation and scrutiny, you begin to find out that that individual is not the writer of the book. Let's take for an instance. I'm pretty sure you all have heard of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Torah. You'll find out that that book is attributed to who? Anybody know? Moses. And when we began to study the material in depth, we began to find out that, well, Moses might not have been the individual who have written those books. And the more and more we began to look at the material, we began to find out that the material just did not come up as being true. Moses lived actually between the last part of the 18th dynasty and the early part of the 19th dynasty. Give or take whoever Pharaoh, still they don't really know definitively which individual really it was that was the Shemsu, who really was the pharaoh or the king at the time that governed this event. But you'll find out that actually it was anywhere from about 1250 to 1350 BC. But a lot of the material that we begin to read about Moses is very, very, fragmented. It's very sketchy. And it doesn't hold enough water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit of material to you out of this book here. Symbol, Sex, and the Stars by Ernest Busenbark in Popular Beliefs. And it deals with an outline of the origin of many customs, superstitions, mystic beliefs, and dogmas, specifically religions. But I'm going to read to you something that's going to really say some things that might change your whole attitude about some of these things. So just bear with me while I go through this. It says, leaders of the Jews faced a possible, and this is during the time, before I go, this is during the time of the expulsion of the Hebrews outside of Egypt. Because a lot of times, I'm pretty sure a lot of us, when we think about these stories, we think of them as literal history. But you're going to find out that as the archaeologists look at the material, it does not coincide with history. Some do, some don't. I also read a magazine called Biblical Archaeology, where that they try to prove a lot of these events. So much so I was in the supermarket and looked at one of them Star magazines, and they found Goliath's head with the stone still in it. So, just to give you an idea on how some of these stories came about. It says, leaders of the Jews faced the possibilities of their people intermarrying with Canaanites and gradually drifting away from their leadership. They also foresaw the danger of their people being absorbed culturally and militarily by their more powerful neighbors to the north, meaning the Egyptians. It says Israel was therefore between the jars of a giant nutcracker, which threatened the supremacy, if not the very existence of Jehovahism. If these dangers were to be overcome, the Jews would have to be welded into a nation quickly, thoroughly united by religion and government, and so completely set apart from all other nations that their identity as a people could never become lost. At this critical period, young King Josiah, apparently being deceived by the priests, became involved in a daring act of trickery, which was part of a plan for purging Israel of its idolatry. One day, in 621 BC, it was reported to the king that Hezekiah, the high priest, had found in the temple the book of laws, which had been strangely missing since its reputed promulgation by Moses some 800 or 900 years earlier. The story is best told in the 22nd or 23rd chapter of 2 Kings. But before continuing with the result of this discovery, it is necessary that a digression be made to speak of another important discovery. While engaged in the preparation of a graduation thesis for the University of Jena in 1805, William M.L. DeWitt decided that the book of laws founded by Hezekiah was none other than the book of Deuteronomy. If Moses had placed the code of laws in the book of Exodus, reasoned DeWitt, why should we have written another book treating of the same subject? In other words, the subject was that they were backsliding, and instead of accepting the word of God or the word of Jehovah and the laws of Jehovah, that they were backsliding and reverting back to the old ancient Egyptian and what we would call Mesopotamian religious systems. And this caused a problem for the early Jews. So what they did was they decided to come up with another book, vis-a-vis the book that was supposedly already in existence. But let me read on. It says, if Moses had the code of laws in the book of Exodus, reasoned DeWitt, why should he have written another book treating of the same subject, in which he gave commands directly contrary to those contained in the first book? Yet in Exodus, every son of Israel had been commanded to set up altars and offer sacrifices, whereas in Deuteronomy, observances of these rites were denied to all but the priesthood. After careful study of the spirit of the language of the new book, and that's really how the material is written, because the spirit of how the material is written is going to identify who becomes the writer. One of the most important things that you're going to find out about information, and that is that if you don't know the author, you're going to have a problem. Now that's not a problem all the way across the board, but it's going to give you a problem in regard to the interpretation of the material and the true meaning of the material. So if you can't tell me the author and what that material was really, what that author's purpose was really about, it's going to be hard to really define what the material is. We take it on assumption. So you're going to find out that author is very important. The title of the book, the author of the book, the date of the book. These are very, very important. The bibliography, the contents, and the introduction, or the preface, either or. Because the preface or the introduction tells you, one, the purpose or the attempt the author is going to make to address the subject matter. The contents gives you a chronological outline on the things that he is going to deal with, what areas he's going to cover. The bibliography gives the source of evidence that he is going to draw from to support his theory or his opinion about a subject matter. Because history is really one man's opinion about an event based on whatever evidence that he has to support it. That's all it is. But let me read on. It says that after careful study of the spirit of the language of the new book, DeWitt observed that it seemed peculiar, well adapted to meet the situation confronting Josiah, and in fact appeared to have been written not by Moses, but by a much later author. Continued research by modern authorities have fully confirmed DeWitt's keen deduction, and it is now generally conceded that Deuteronomy was written probably in Babylonia during the reign of King Manasseh or King Josiah. DeWitt discovered not only through new light of on Deuteronomy, it also made it necessary to reconsider the entire story of the life of Moses. Scholars had long known that many details in the life of the great lawgiver were similar to events in the myths of the great god Bacchus from Greece. Like Moses, Bacchus was born in Egypt, was found floating in a basket, and had both real and foster mothers. Like Moses, he had made water gush from a stone by striking it with his staff. Like Moses, he wore 2 horns on his head. He became a lawmaker and wrote his laws on 2 tablets of stone. Moses performed miracles with snakes, like Bacchus, and was always portrayed with snakes. Moses waved his staff and made the waters of the Red Sea turn back. And Bacchus, did the same thing with the waters of Orontes River in Syria, in India. Now, what's the next question that should be asked here? I just read you something, a parallel of 2 stories, basically the same. What should be your question?
My question is the origin of the Jews. That's my main question. You started off talking about Moses and then Pentateuch,
right?
But I want to know the origin of the Jews.
Well, I'm going to tell you this. The origin of the Jews actually start with Moses, not Abraham. And I'll tell you why. Because laws that govern the conduct and behavior of a people determine what that people is or are. And you'll find that those laws do not come into being until Moses. There are no laws during Abraham's time, no laws during Jacob's time, no laws during Isaac's time, no laws during Noah's time. The laws come into being with Moses. Moses is represented as the first patriarch, even though they call Abraham the father of Judaism. Yes, ma'am.
So before Moses,
do we need to get a little bit of this on the mic?
Say that again.
Before Moses, the Baptist was doing the same thing as Moses.
That's right.
So why didn't the book start?
Hold on,
Can we get it on the mic? So other people can hear you? Miss Batchelor?
What that really means is that the question here is that, right, what she actually identified as the parallel between Bacchus from Greece and this concept that comes, and by the way, the Bacchus Greece story is not really Greek, it's really Mesopotamian. But anyway, what it's really trying to identify is one thing, and that is that if the stories are so similar, if the stories parallel each other so closely, the next question that should have been asked would be, what is oldest? What came first? When I began to study, I began to find out that the stories of Bacchus outweighed Moses 2-to-1. So much so that there's stories that predate the Judeo-Christian stories by thousands and thousands of years. So a lot of the stories that we find are nothing but parallels of stories that have already been into existence, but now they are represented as stories that are of original nature. Yes, ma'am.
So would that tell us that when, as we know the Bible, that
Can we get that on the mic?
came out of Egypt, would it
Ms. Bachelor, could you come over here so we can get on the mic and we can hear you?
See, we ain't gonna be able to do that. You know.
I can do it. All right, when you ask the question, trust to repeat it.
Okay, go ahead.
When he gets into the other part, I'm going to run around with this microphone and it can reach all over here, I think. All right?
Okay, go ahead.
so-
Make your statement, ma'am.
let me see if I can cut it down. Ancient history, we did this through mental telepathy. And then when the Jews came out, exited out of Egypt, could it be that they brought our customs with them, and they began to study later in the century, and this is the reason that the books start later.
Let's give this lady a hand, because she just hit it on the head. And that is that, let me explain how that happened. The story of the Jews actually starts with an individual by the name of Abraham coming from a place called Chaldea, or Ur, which is the capital city of Chaldea. He actually migrated from Ur to a place called Haran, from Haran to Canaan, and then from Canaan to Egypt. How they acquired this name Hebrew is based on an event that took place in regard, this is the common story of them crossing over a river. The very word Hebrew means to cross over. Now, this story actually identifies some very important events, and that is that prior to that, according to the Judeo-Christian concepts, that these individuals that they came in contact with were pagans. Anybody here know what a pagan is?
Black people.
Tell me what it is, Robert.
I think a pagan is,
So is us.
I think it's a wrong term as far as I know, that a person who lives in a country or in a village.
And that's exactly what it is. He was a country dweller. And the reason that it was that is because the majority of Christianity had its root in a city environment. And the individuals who lived in the peripheral did not get the information until later. As you find out, words have evolutionary processes. That's why if you look up a word in the dictionary, it'll have 1, 2, or 3 meanings. What those meanings identify is the evolutionary change of the definition of the term. So the oldest term would be first, or the most recent term would be first, determining on how it's set up in your dictionary. But what you'll find out is that when you look at the word pagan, it also will say any individual that is not of the Judeo-Christian background, which actually means any individuals that is not Christian, Jew, or Muslim. Which also has a lot to do with this word heathen. Because I know y'all go around and y'all have an ankh, a guy see me wearing an ankh, he said, look, you believe in paganism. You into, heathenism. And I asked him what the word pagan was, and he didn't know. But it just shows you what our depth of information is in regard to the clarity of the things that we involve ourselves with. And this is what I'm trying to do, just to clarify some of these things. But let me read to you the footnote of what is said here. This footnote is written by Spinoza. 1679. In 1679, Spinoza observed that in the Pentateuch, which is the 5 books, certain towns and places bore names that were not given to them until several centuries after Moses.
Could you repeat that again?
Excuse me. It says in 1679, Spinoza, which is a great Jewish historian, observed that in the Pentateuch, certain towns and places bore names that were not given to them until several, listen to this, several centuries after Moses. That's like saying that South Orange Avenue is South Orange Avenue now, correct? But 500 years from now, we changed it to El Hajj Malik Shabazz Avenue. But I gave a speech here and I said, I was on the corner of El Hajj Malik El Shabazz Avenue. What does that make you think?
Crazy.
Either I'm crazy or I have a hell of a degree of foresight, you know.
Or you're a time traveler.
A time traveler, right?
Big time.
Listen to this one. Repeated occurrences of such expressions as the Lord said to Moses and Moses said, etc., also indicate that the Pentateuch was written not by Moses but by another author or a third party. Because usually when you write something yourself, you wouldn't say, and God said unto Moses, you would say, God said unto me, or God said unto I. So what they're saying is that this is what it was meant when DeWitt said the language, the spirit of the language in which it was written does not indicate that Moses was the author of this material. Let me go on. It says, the fact that the book of Deuteronomy, wait a minute, let me see. Oh, the fact that Deuteronomy describes the death and burial of Moses was seen as the final proof of the theory. And that is that here's a guy that wrote his own death. Now, I would not have made a big deal about it because we know that a lot of these guys was inspired by God and had divine intervention and, you know, all of that. But it does seem funny that he could have divine intervention in his death and then not foresee what would happen to his people after he died. Because the major objective was to galvanize, remember in the first part of this paragraph it said was to bring glue, to galvanize all the forces and to make the Jews a whole people. But all you have to do is read the story. As soon as they left Egypt, they went into wandering and they began to disperse. So much so that the pruning period, the purging period, was them 40 years in the desert where a certain amount of generations died off. For them really to become the grips with what really happened. So the real glue that began to come together came way after. I want to read another piece of material.
I want to ask a question on that also.
Go after the question. Now the question.
Question? No, you don't have a question answer period.
No, let me ask the question.
You
Go
don't have
ahead,
a question
sir.
answer. He made that statement plain. You had a question answer.
Go ahead.
I was the other day and I saw a guy ask a question.
Go ahead, bro. Don't worry about
Okay.
it.
Now you saw about the word choices and stuff. Now will you explain to me, explain to us, what's the difference between Judite and Jew?
First of all, the word Jew is a very modern day term, as Baba Sinda actually knows. It's a European term, actually French to be specific. The word actually comes from the word of Yehuda. And it actually is from the tribe of Yehuda, whether you know it or not. That was one of the southern tribes that came during the fall of Babylon. You had 12 major tribes. But the tribes that we should be specifically, you know, I would say concerned with are the 2 major tribes that were in the southern region. You had 10 tribes in the northern region, which was called Israel. You had 2 tribes in the southern region, which was called Judea. Or what we today, at that time was called Yehuda. Well, you had the tribe of Yehuda and Benjamin, or Yehuda and Dan, depending on which books you read. But you'll find out that what actually happened is that after the Jews were broken down, that means that, let me just run through this real quick. And that is that the actual story of the Jews actually start with Saul, King Saul. And Saul, well, I should say the patriarch Samuel, they went to Samuel and they asked Samuel, look, you know, the Jews wanted a real king to govern them like all other nations. So Samuel was telling them, look, if I give you a king, he ain't going to treat you like, you know, like the divine is going to treat you. He's going to be... And they was begging him and begging him. Eventually, Samuel calls upon God. God, you know, complies with his wishes, and they give him this individual called King Saul. Now, King Saul actually rules for a few years, and he just messes things all up. And eventually, what happens is that he began to have a conflict of interest between the next individual who's coming on the scene, and that's David. David and Saul get into a conflict. Eventually, David takes over, and you have this big reign of King David. Everybody heard of King David. David actually rules for about 50 years, 40 or 50 years, and then his son Solomon rules for about 50 years. Those were the golden ages of the Hebrew or Jewish experience. And I should say Hebrew because, and I really shouldn't say Hebrew, really it's an Israelite experience, because there are no more Hebrews specifically after Jacob at that time wrestles with God and comes up with the name Israel, and eventually the individuals after him become Israelites. But prior to that, during their sojourn from coming into Egypt, they acquired this name Hebrew. But as I go on, you begin to find out that after these two major rules between David and Solomon, Assyrians and Syrians come in, and the Babylonians come in, and they actually sack the cities. Assyrian cities were sacked by the 10 northern tribes were sacked by the Assyrians. And they became to be absorbed into the empire of the Assyrian government. This happened in 722 BC. In 586, Sumeria or Samaria was sacked by Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar takes those two tribes of Jews from Samaria to Babylon. While in Babylon, they stay a few years, and the Babylonians begin to have a problem with Persians. There arises a king called Cyrus. Cyrus ends up taking over Babylon. He decides that he's going to let the Hebrews, or this term, the Israelites, go, and they begin to flee, a certain amount of them flee back to the temple to try to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. Now, mind you, a lot of them assimilated into the Babylonian culture, never to be heard from again. But a small group go back. From that period, we get the first writings that come to us that are recognized as the Torah, or what is recognized as the Old Testament. Those books are written by Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra becomes the focal point. Ezra. You'll find in some books, in older books, they call it Esdras. Esdras. But Ezra becomes the focal point. Those books actually have their start about 450, 444 BC. And that is the oldest documented evidence that we have any written evidence for. Prior to that, during Moses' time, during Abraham's time, during Adam's time and all that, there's no document evidence to prove anything. They are just characters so much as mythological figures as they are historical figures. Now, I'm saying this, that there's no evidence at this present time. And the way the material is written, it will give us the impression that the stories are allegorical in nature, with principally oriented. Now, that's not to make it true. As I say to you before, I want y'all to be clear about this, that I'm not saying this is etched in stone. But based on my research, I would say that these figures are allegorical or mythological, and that they represent some events that were to be documented in regard to an evolutionary process of a particular group of individuals but most of all, to bring some credence to what these people are about. Because prior to that, they have no real history. Remember, no real history. I have a document right here. This comes from the New York Times, Tuesday, July 11th, 1989. And when I went to Egypt with Dr. Ben, he always said that, you know how Dr. Ben is. Wasn't no Jews here. You know, this is a man who is a Hebrew. Wasn't no Jews here. No Jews ever worked on these pyramids. There was no such a thing that ever happened. I don't know why these white people are telling you all of this. And, you know, and I always say this. It's nice to make statements. But as a student of history, I need the documents. I need some evidence. So, I know that everybody here has seen Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, and you've seen these Jews stamping on mud and, you know, straw, you know, because one of the things was, you know, they took straw away from them and told them to make bricks just out of mud, and they was upset. But it just blew my mind away, as Baba Sinder and a few of other you that have been to Egypt know that there's no mud brick in the pyramids. You have stone that is half the size of that table, that weighs anywhere from 2 to 2.5 tons apiece. 2 to 2.5 tons, one stone. They were actually cut out of rock quarries that go anywhere from 100 to 150 miles or 200 miles away from that geographical area. One of the concerns of archaeologists was how did they travel so far with some of this material. Even today, you'll find out that when you do go to Egypt, that they still have one of the obelisks that they were actually getting ready to erect, but, or should I say, they were finishing it up. And in the process of finishing it, it cracked. So you can, right now, you can go to Egypt and walk on that obelisk. Obelisk is the long monument like we see down in the Washington Monument. That's what an obelisk is. But when I began to read that, and Dr. Ben used to say, well, first of all, no Jews could have ever worked on the pyramids because, one, the first Jew was born as Abraham between 1700 and 1775. Now, you know how Professor Simmons is he say, look, you know, you can't be saying that just to anybody because they use all kind of numbers. He says, so play with them like they play with you. 1700 to 2000, give them a couple hundred. No problem, give them a couple hundred. So let's say we gave them 2000 BC. But all the material, the book that I just told you, the chronological prehistory, in that it says 1700 Abraham was born. Yes, sir, Baba Sinder?
May I say one thing just for us to look at? Almost everyone thinks that the straw is used to hold the brick together. I'm suggesting to you that the straw is used to put between the layers of bricks to keep them from sticking. Okay?
Okay. Y'all heard it from Baba Sinder. But when I began to find out, I said, well, he said 1700 to 2000. I said, well, okay. But Dr. Ben said, well, Abraham could not have, no Jew could have ever had worked on the pyramid because the last pyramid was actually erected 2700 BC. That's literally 700 years before 2000. And if we just use the 700, that's actually 1,000 years. That's a millennium. That means his mother's grandmother's grandmother wasn't even born. So how could he have worked on this pyramid? And these are stories that are told, that are handed down as being fact, when in reality they're fiction. But be it as it may, working with Professor Simmons, and as you can see through the documents, anything that goes through the newspaper, and as I told you before, I read anything I can get my hands on. I read the New York Times, the Financial Times, I read the Wall Street Journal, I read the Daily News, I read the Current Affairs, I read Matt's book covers anything. As long as I can find some information. And anything that's pertinent to our experience, I make sure I try to make it available. But this one, as I said, comes out in the New York Times, Tuesday, July 11th, 1989. And let me read to you. It says, stated with Pharaoh's expert study of laborers, And they were studying the labor force that they used in Egypt in order to erect some of these particular monuments. And this is what it says. It says, now that the power and splendor of the pharaohs have largely been revealed, archaeologists are making a concerted effort to learn how the common people lived in ancient Egypt, starting with the laborers who hefted the huge blocks of stone to erect the monumental pyramids at Giza. Excavations this year by a team from Yale University working with the Egyptian Antiquities Organization have produced the first strong evidence pointing to where the pyramid builders lived. South of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, beyond a limestone quarry, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a bakery and a brewery. Where there was bread and beer, could the quarters of the workers have been far away? So at least we know one thing, and that is that they ate and they drank. We know that. It says, it is archaeologically impossible that the traces of thousands of workers and their dwellings could disappear totally, said Mark Lehner, an Egyptologist at Yale, who directed the bakery excavation. Scholars look to new discoveries about the laborers to round out their understanding of the social and economical organizations required for such a daunting engineering project. But between 2640 and 2550 BC, on a plateau across from the Nile, from modern Cairo, and not far from the ancient capital of Memphis, the three pyramids at Giza, guarded by the Sphinx, were, and God knows that we're not talking about Sphinx, the Har Akhet, which is the name of the Sphinx, and the Sphinx is a European term, and a lot of these terms that I'm going to be using are European terms. But it says that were regarded as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and the only one still standing. Each pyramid is the final resting place of a pharaoh, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Modern engineers marvel at the feat accomplished without beast of burden or the wheel, and with no other mechanical aids than the level and roller, as well as a copper chisel and stone hammer. Now they call that the Chalcolithic period, where you have a cross between some, metal urge going on and rock or stone. That's called Chalcolithic period. It says, listen to this, which is the very important part. It says, they conclude that the rulers of Egypt's old kingdom must have been amongst, listen to this, among the best organizers of human labor the world has ever seen. And the rulers did not accomplish this by using legions of slaves, as had long been believed, but rather drafted workers on a rotating schedule who were paid. Say what Brother Trust say. It's not Dr. Ben yelling down your throat. These are the white boys that are on the cutting edge, supposedly, of doing this research.
He said Egyptologists.
That's what they call themselves, Robert, Egyptologists. I don't know what that means sometimes. But this is some of the material. So that just throws that part of the material out the window. Now, what I want to do, I'm going to jump a little bit, and we're going to deal with some of this, one of the most important characters in all of Christianity. Now, I know y'all know this guy. I call him JC. But you'll find out that the story of Christ, or the story of Jesus the Christ, is not, believe this, is not a new story. As a matter of fact, it's so old that it's important for us to realize that when we talk about these stories that we know that they go far back in antiquity, further than what we can imagine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the relationship of how that story arose in corresponding to celestial movements in the sky that identified some very important events in human history. At this very remote period, one of the most important things in regard to human experience is survival. That becomes the most important aspect about people. And what they began to find out is that if they wanted to survive longer, they would at least have to control or harness their environment. So one of the most important things that the Egyptians did first was that they began to control the very nature of the usage of the Nile River, because it was the lifeline, it was the life force of all of Egypt. One reason is because for those that have been to Egypt know this, and that is that it doesn't rain too often in Egypt. Matter of fact, when I was in Egypt, I was on a felucca with an individual, which is a boat, and I asked him, you know, I'm looking up in the sky, I mean, it's just hot day after day after day, and I asked the guy, I said, well, when the last time it rained here? He said, rain? He said, I'm 42 years old. He said, I only see rain once. It trickle, trickle, drop, drop. Stop, that's it. And I was like, man, what do you mean? No rain, no clouds, nothing. So I said, wow, that's kind of deep. And then I began to realize the significant impact on what the Nile had in regard to life, on sustaining the life of these people. The Nile was everything. So they're harnessing their environment, the agricultural, the domestication of the plant life, which is the agrarian society, the domestication of animals, the pastoral societies, the moving away from the hunting and gathering or the nomadic type of life to a more sedentary life where everything is stable, you know, stationary. And what I began to look at is that when you get a development of an agrarian society, one of the most important things that began to coincide with an agrarian society is the knowledge of the heavenly bodies. Because they cannot plan unless they know what's going to happen. And they cannot plant because in Egypt the water would overflow and it would flood all the area. So it became important for them to understand how to control this water. So they built dikes, they rediverted the water, they built wells, and most of all, they built their houses on higher land. Right. And we were at Sister Ricketti's class this morning in regard to the Kemetic history class. We talked about the whole process of the Nile flow, the upper and the lower regions, the higher land terrain in the south and the lower land terrain in the north, and why the water flows down in the northerly direction. We talked about that. So for those that don't know, water doesn't flow up, you know. But when I looked at that, I said, man, that's kind of deep. So in order for them to deal with that, they had to understand the seasonal changes. They had to understand the seasonal changes. They had to understand a 365-day year event in relationship to the sun. And that's not only because, remember, the sun concept came out of a lunar concept, which is their understanding of the relationship of the phases of the moon, and that comes out of a stellar concept. The oldest is stellar, next is lunar, and the most recent, and which we are on today, is called the solar. That's how you end up with 365.25 days. But you'll find out that when the Egyptians came up with this, according to guys like Wayne Chandler, Dr. Shak Anta Diop, and some astrologers, they come up with the position that there was the accepted position that the mainstream Egyptological community believed that the earliest civilization in ancient Egypt, or the earliest development of ancient Egypt, went anywhere from 32 or 3100 BC up until about 35. Now, some of the individuals in our community stretched it as far as 5,000 BC. But when astronomers began to look at it, they say, nope, we don't think so. We think it might go back anywhere between 10 to 17,000 BC. Now, how they came up with this is they began to find out that the helical rising of the star Sirius, which we will call in some, astronomical, circles as the dog star, which the Dogon people have made famous, that this event actually takes place, it makes a full procession, a full complete procession every 1,461 years. In other words, it has a 1,500-year interval in order for this event to have a complete cycle. And they said that these events identified, according to the Egyptians, their understanding of how they calculated their calendar of this event. The sun in conjunction with this particular star, the helix, the solstice star in Greek, of this event taking place every 1,461 years. Now, what's unique about that is that any astronomer will tell you that in order to actually document an event that would take a 1,500-year interval, you would have to watch it quite a long period of time. In other words, if it happened every 1,500 years, they said to make sure that it would be accurate, you would have to watch it at least 5,000 to 10,000 years to really be on point. So let's look at it. The oldest documented calendar in ancient Egypt, according to the chronological astronomical sense, is 4,245 BC. 4,245 BC. Now, if you add, let's just use the most conservative number. Let's use 5,000. Add 5,000 to 4,245 BC, you get at least 10,000 right there. But Shaka Anta Diop said that he would not venture to give it such a conservative number. And he gave it 10,000, and he regulated that time period to be 17,000 BC. I'm under the agreement with Shak, only under the position now also because I know that in order for you to do something, even to write it down, it has been oral for thousands of years before it has become literal written history. And second, now, with all this new sophisticated technology, they have come to grips with one thing, is that the so-called Har Em-Akhet, or Sphinx, is actually, they think, 3 times to 10 times older than what they assumed it to be. And this is really rocking the socks of the archaeological community, because now they have to rearrange their chronological dating process for a long period of time. For those that don't know, I spoke about dating last time I was here. I have a document here for those that when you come up, you can pick it up, it says how old things are, and they show you the different processes of dating. That, written record, tree dating, magnet dating, carbon-14 dating, thermoluminescence, all different kinds. So you can pick that up here to find out some more information about the process. Potassium, argon, all different types of datings that they're using now. But one thing I found out about this observance of celestial bodies, I began to look at it and find out that these observances are the very fabric, the essence to the religious systems of Africans and all agrarian people. The essence. And when I began to read this book, Symbol, Sex, and the Stars, The World's Saviors, Signs and Symbols of Premortal Man by Albert Churchwood, Natural Genesis, Ancient Egypt, Light of the World, by Gerald Massey, just so many numerous books that dealt with this subject matter, they began to open this ball of wax up even more. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some events. I'm going to use the board here. I'm going to show you some events involving a celestial event that took place that actually gave us the concept of Jesus the Christ. This is the universe. This equatorial meridian. Now, in ancient times, they called them cardinal points. They're cardinal points of the universe. These are the polar points. And this is called the, we'll put it like this. This is called the winter, no, excuse me, summer. Winter, spring, fall. Summer solstice, winter solstice, spring equinox, fall equinox. They're called the cardinal points of the universe. They regulate the changing of seasonal development in its relationship to the planet. Because this helped them understand how they began to create this calendar. Because remember, originally it was just based on the lunar phases of the moon, but they ended up coming up short. I think it was 354 days, actually, they came up with. And they would always have to adjust their calendar. So much so, when the Romans and the Greeks picked it up, they would just wait, literally, you know, like today would be October 15th, tomorrow would be, you know, November 1st, just so that they could adjust, you know, to make up. But what happens in regard to this event is this. This is the sun. This is the earth. And you know the earth travels around the sun, and it takes that 365.25 days to do so. But what happened is that in order for them to look at this event and looking at it in a metaphorical and an esoteric perspective, they began to see changes that went on in this event that actually coincided with some events that went on in their environmental situation. Now, the earth here, you'll find out that this, we will even give them dates. This will be December 22nd, March 22nd, June 22nd, and September 22nd. Now, what these events and these dates identify is that those are the changing points in relationship to the seasonal changes. If you notice that December 22nd, actually to December 25th is a very important day. What date is that?
Jingle bells.
Jingle bells, huh? Now, you'll find out that the reason that this was called December 25th and it has a relationship with the birth of Christ was because that from the relationship between the earth and the sun, the earth is at its most densest point, and the sun is the weakest in its relationship to the earth. We get least amount of sunlight. In other words, you have twice the amount of sunlight twice the amount of darkness in regard to sunlight. So much so that on those 3 days, from December 22nd to the 25th, they're called the shortest days of the year. Where it is twice as dark as it is light. They call that the very death of the sun. And on the 25th, this is the most densest point, the 22nd to the 25th, but on the 25th, the earth begins to move. Now, in relationship to the sun, that actually identifies of the resurrection of the sun's heat, its relationship, its light to the earth. And from that day, from the 25th of December to March 22nd, the sun, in relationship to the earth, is getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and the days are getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And what it's identifying is that in relationship to the sun, the earth is now benefiting from its positional changes. They call that, in ancient times, we call that the birth of the S-U-N. Not the S-O-N. It was the S-U-N first. The birth of the S-U-N. And then, actually what begins to happen is that on its journey, its procession to this period, you'll find out that the environmental conditions go through a drastic change. Because when it's at its least point, from say fall to December, actually that's why they call it fall, because everything what? Falls. It begins to die, decay, stop, stagnant. And then, whether you know it or not, all of this period, under the meridian line, all of this is called the underworld. This is the underworld. The day, they call them the cold days of darkness. This is called the overworld, or the days of light, enlightenment. And this actually was to identify with what is called the battle between light and darkness. The battle between light and darkness, good and evil. Get it? On this procession from the earth, moving from December 25th to March 22nd, March 22nd also is a very important date, because that date identifies with some events that actually represent what we have today. That's why you got an 80-degree day today. And that is because the earth has now reached its point where that once it goes to this equatorial meridian, this period right here, that is called, in seasonal perspectives, it's called what? Spring. Say that again? Spring. Spring. And what it identifies is that the sun's relationship to the earth is now come to the point where that the strength is of equal strength. That's why they call it the equatorial. The equinox. That means you have the same amount of light as you do the same amount of darkness. So if you got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and it just got light, it will go down 6 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean in the evening. 12 and 12. So you have a vernal equinox on the spring and a vernal equinox in the fall. But what's significant about the vernal equinox in the spring is that life goes through a drastic change. Because we are now going from the point of death to the point of what? Life. But they also call it something else. According to Jesus, resurrection. The resurrection. Life goes through that period of resurrection. The plants turn green. I mean, you know, the grass turns green, the plants turn pretty colors. Right? These are all, the animals begin to mate. These are all things that identify with that concept called Easter.
And folklore says sunrise in the human body.
That's right, everything. But one thing also you know is that during this period of time here, this equatorial meridian, once it reaches March 22nd and goes over the equatorial meridian, they call that, once this passes over this line, it's called the what?
Passover.
Y'all heard of that before, right? Mm-hmm. Passover. Sure. All right. Yes, sir.
Is the fact that we don't know this astrological background for all these things, is that just coincidental, or is, I mean, or is there some reason why we don't know this background for all these, astrological background for all these, for all the things we celebrate and yeah, celebrate?
Right. Well, the reason that is because, first of all, the Christian church is a government. It's a power-broken government. And it wanted to keep individuals at bay based on them being able to subjugate you with just a little bit amount of information.
He did a good job, by the way. He did a very good job. He did a very good job.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But they also call this the period not only... Yes.
1 second.
Go ahead, Rudy.
One second. Go ahead.
Your interpretation, is it from the Roman Catholic point of view, or is from the Protestant point of view? Because, as you said, you don't want to get into an esoteric discussion about some points. There's no way in the King James Version of the Scripture that it says you celebrate Christmas, you celebrate Easter, and you celebrate any holiday.
And Brother Rudy, you are correct. You're 100% correct. And what he is identifying is that these are events that were schismatic controversies in the early part of the church in regard to whether certain events or certain religious holidays would be accepted. And you'll find out that this is what actually split the church directly in half in its most earliest period. That was the period that actually leads from about, I would say, the 2nd century BC, the 2nd century AD, up into about the 5th century. Now, I'm pretty sure you have heard of a period or a council that was held called the Nicene Council. It was held in 325 AD, but literally they had 20 major councils. The ones that you really want to be familiar with are the major 5. And that is the Nicene Council in 325. You want to be familiar with the Council of Constantinople, the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon, and the Council of Constantinople too. Those individuals who really want to find out more information on it, you can get this book here, and you'll find it. It's called The Historical Origins of Christianity. A good friend of mine from Chicago wrote that book. But he gives you a good outline, a basic map. If you want to get more details, you go to the library. But it gives you basic information about these events. But those councils actually was to quell a lot of the controversies and conjectural debates that went on in regard to certain interpretations and definitions of the church. Now, Rudy used the term Protestant or Catholic, but he really also knows this is that Catholic.
No, Roman Catholic.
Listen, let me just finish. The Roman Catholic concept, the word Catholic actually means universal. The very nature of Roman Catholicism was based on Rome. Before that, there was no Catholics. Believe this. Catholicism does not get started until after Constantine becomes emperor in 312. Prior to that, Christians are being persecuted from Diocletian to Diocletian, all the way up to 302.
I'd like to interject this, Trevor. Along the same line as you're going.
Put it on the mic, man.
You can
Go ahead.
Zoroastrian. This stuff is supposedly the first revealed religion. This stuff is synthesized. So some of these concepts follow through a thread of this evolvement.
That's right. And he's correct. Not only Zoroaster, but the most influential religion in its parallel relationship to Christianity is Mithraism. The study of Mithra. And Mithra so much so parallels Christianity that a lot of the converts for Christianity were mistaken as Mithra, followers. And some people believe, some scholars believe that the reason that the so-called story of Jesus, or Jesus, was actually crucified because he was mistaken for a Mithranite. Now, read up on the study of the religious system of Mithraism. They actually existed parallel at the same time as the early Christian dogma and also Zoroastrianism and a few other religious systems that exist. The worship of Adonis, the worship of Attis, the worship of Aphrodite, the worship of Athena, and a few others. But because the reason that was because in Rome was like New York. You could do anything. You can go, like in New York, you don't expect to see nothing out of the normal. Everything out of the normal. So Rome was the same way. They would almost allow you to do anything, long as you gave homage to the emperor. We don't care what you do, just long as you, high rules to Caesar. That's all what it was about. But eventually, as it did in Rome, it became one of their major downfalls. Yes, sir.
I want to say this, but he was saying December is winter, and December the 25th I was always taught that December the 25th was Nimrod's birthday.
Well, the real thing about Nimrod, and I study that too, is that Nimrod cannot be identified in concrete history. It's a story.
And it's in Jesus.
Well, that's what we dealing with here. We showing you that the story is really a concept, and that the concept became anthropomorphized. The word anthropomorphic actually just means in the person of a man. And I'm going to read to you how it developed as I go on. But this period, Passover, which is in the time of the Lamb in the zodiac, the Lamb, and they call Jesus the what? Right. And then you'll find out that during that time he was crucified. But in the ancient metaphorical, they didn't call this the Passover, they called it the crossification. Cross. So they took the crossification and made it crucifixion. Now, what I'm going to do now is that you'll find out that as it begins to rise and go into the longest day of the year, which is June 22nd, they call that the first day of what? Summer. And the winter the summer solstice. And that identifies when summer begins. From that day on, the sun begins to do what? It begins to get weaker and weaker. That means that the earth begins to decline. The sun don't move nowhere. Remember that. The sun don't move nowhere. You know, they're going to get me on grammatical English here. But remember that the sun begins to weaken. So now, let me read a story to you that deals with this whole concept of the death and the rebirth of the sun, which actually identifies this whole concept of Jesus the Christ from a Christmas and Easter concept. And what I want you to do is, when you hear the word sun and you listen to the story, I'm talking about the S-U-N, not the S-O-N, the S-U-N. Remember, the book that I'm reading from, Symbol, Sex, and the Stars by Ernest Busenbach. Chapter 7, Death and Rebirth of the Sun God. In the fertility myths, the sun was represented as a handsome young god who impregnated the earth with his life-giving warmth and life, thus being the source of growth in vegetation and stimulator of the procreational activities which cause animals to mate and bring forth their young. Everywhere that the sun worship flourished, the sun god was honored as a supreme deity, the father of all creation. In the light-dark myths, the sun was portrayed as a powerful blonde hero who slew a serpent, dragon, or other animals, which typified the dark forces of nature, the darkness of night and the cold, dark days of winter. Features drawn from both the fertility myths and the light-dark myths were represented in a third type which reflected the prevailing theories concerning astronomy and astrology. Where the old fertility myths had depicted the sun god as the lover of a virgin moon or earth goddess, the type now under consideration represented him as the son of a virgin, both his birth and his death taking place at the time of the winter solstice in the zodiac sign of Virgo, the Virgin. How many people know what a virgin is?
One who's untouched? No. One who has no kids?
One who has no kids? One who's not touched?
One who is pure?
One who is pure. Let me read to you the definition here in regard to the term virgin. And this is what I want you to understand about the whole process of the development of an evolutionary process in regard to terms, because terms don't always have the same meaning. As they develop, they take on different meanings. But listen, the apparent misuse of the term virgin, which is applied to Ishtar, Venus, Aphrodite, and all other mother goddesses of antiquity, is due to the fact that originally the word denoted merely an unmarried woman or maiden. She might even be a prostitute, a term which Ishtar applied to herself. As goddess of generation, she was devoted to the loss of chastity and to childbirth, although not to marriage. Unmarried women of the East, whether virgins or prostitutes, wore veils to indicate their unmarried status. And when Isis is made to say that no man has lifted her veil, she means that she has never been a party to a marriage ceremony. So what consummates a marriage in our society? Y'all didn't even know what it meant. What consummates a marriage in this society? The lifting of the veil. Not the kissing.
They wasn't wearing the kima at all.
But the lifting of the veil. Because the lifting of a veil revealed to you the image of that individual that would not be threatening to anybody else, and that was your wife, so nobody else could claim her. So it was okay for everybody else to see it. Listen to this, though, which is quite different than what is today. It says, the sacred prostitutes who served in the temples of the mother goddesses were likewise called the holy virgins. You hear what I said? The prostitutes who served in the temples of the mother goddesses were likewise called the holy virgins. In Greece, children who were born of unmarried mothers were called Parthenoli or Partheno, or virgin born. What do they call them today? Bastards.
They call them something else.
Go ahead.
Call them bastards.
That's right. They call them bastards. Now think of the change of what happened here. In ancient times, when that happened, just think of how many women now would be sacred. Think about that.
That was a corrupt priest playing games with the population.
Excuse me?
That was a corrupt priesthood playing games with the population.
Well, let me read on, Brother Rudy, and let's see what that really says. Let me get back to the story of the rebirth of the sun. It says that because it was believed that the sun regulated the planting and harvesting periods, appointed and distributed the seasons, ran through the climates, swayed the earth, etc., the sun god was looked upon as the legislator, lawgiver, conquering hero. Now don't that sound like somebody you know? It says, because the warm rays of the sun were thought to promote cheerfulness, good health, he was called the bringer of light and enlightenment. The sun. It says he was thought to bring light and enlightenment, wisdom, peace, health, prosperity, the good physician and savior of humanity, the son of righteousness who overcame disorder, chaos, strife, sickness, and disease. We're talking about the sun. Think about that. It says probably no myth ever existed which possessed such universal appeal. It was a synthesis of the solar myths, the magnificent temples built in the honor of the sun, and the colorful festivals, prayers, and rich gifts with which the people of many countries honored him, testified to the implicit faith and fervent reverence of millions of worshippers of this youthful sun hero who died and was reborn to save humanity. He was generally represented as being born in a cave, the sun, or cavern. His birth often taking place after a conception of 10 months, being born of an undefiled virgin mother, of noble family, the birth being heralded by blazing stars and signs in the sky. The infant was said to have been taken by his parents to a distant land to escape from a jealous tyrant who wished to slay him. He amazed his elders by his ferocity, grew up in obscurity, healed the sick, and was crucified in the prime of his life. His death was marked by earthquakes, lightning, and darkening of the sky. He was resurrected in 3 days and brought light and peace to the world. Although all of these incidents are not to be found in every solar myth, at least part of them are to be found in the careers of solar heroes of every age and country. Long before the Christian era, they were employed in the stories of Tammuz in Babylonia, Attis in Phrygia, Adonis in Phoenicia, Osiris and Horus in Egypt, Bacchus and Dionysus in India, Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Apollo in Greece, Mithra in Persia, Yu in China, and Krishna in India. Some of these motives, particularly that of the virgin birth, may be traced in the careers of Hercules, Prometheus, Asclepius, Zeus, and in numerous obscure local sun gods of many places. The sun legend, or the sun god legend, gave rise to the belief that similar miracles attended the births of all great characters, historical as well as mythical, until finally many public men deliberately spread stories of their own virgin birth as evidence of their greatness. Every man who was renowned for virtuous living or for intellectual superiority was supposed to have had a portion of the divine mind or essence incorporated or incarnate in him. Legends developed that miraculous circumstances attended the births of Plato, Pythagoras, Alexander, Augustus, Zoroaster, King Sargon, Amenhotep II, Buddha, Socrates, Tamerlane, Pope Gregory, Queen Hatshepsut, Serpio Africanus, Caesar, Apollonius, and many others. Now, what do y'all see different in that story? One thing that I said about the last individuals. Let me read it again. These are the individuals. You're going to find something peculiarly different. It says, legends developed that miraculous circumstances attended the births of Plato, Pythagoras, Alexander, Augustus, Zoroaster, King Sargon, Amenhotep II, Buddha, Socrates, Tamerlane, Pope Gregory, Queen Hatshepsut, Serpio Africanus, Caesar, Apollonius, and many others. Sir, one was a woman. Now think about that. How many people believe that? Don't you know, one of the most important stories in the Catholic Church is this, that they keep hidden, is the story of Pope Joan. How many people know about Pope Joan? Woman. Right. She actually went under the name of Pope John, but Pope Joan was one of the greatest popes that ever lived. Matter of fact, they had a program on Channel 7, I think it was, a few months ago, you know, and you can go to the library and find that there's a book just called Pope Joan. Just look it up and find out. But this was a woman who, actually, she was so well versed in biblical, you know, history and law that she became one of the advisors to a pope. The pope eventually made her bishop and then cardinal, and she ended up becoming pope. But because there was such a stigma in regard to women taking such a position, that she happened to befriend an individual who was the head of a country at the time. And her major concern was that, you know, she had them natural needs, you know. And he began to accommodate those needs. Eventually she became pregnant. To make a long story short, at one of her great, you know, ceremonies and celebrations of her conquests over Europe and actually fighting off the Saracens or the Arabs coming into Europe, she was on the front steps of the basilica, and as she was walking down, she was, I guess, at this maybe about 6, maybe 7 months gone, and she was trying to cover it up because she disguised herself as a man. Back there, it wasn't too hard to do that, you know. It may be not too hard to do it now, but anyway, while she was on the steps, she got pains and everything. She fell out. Nobody knew what was wrong. She unloosened her belt, and they found out she was pregnant. When the crowd found out that she was pregnant, they ripped her in half. They literally tore her in pieces.
Was that the one, John of Mance? It's called England?
That's right. I
John
think
of
that's
Mance, right? The Mance, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But let me go on. It says that, excuse me, that, it says that, that even Nero seems to have been made some effort to be credited with virgin birth as a token of his greatness. And Emperor Constantine did likewise. A king, listen to this one, a king of Greece found it necessary to issue a decree declaring the death penalty to women who attributed their fatherhood of their children to the gods. Now that might be a holdover. That might be a holdover why they look bad on women having kids out of wedlock. Think about it. But let me move on a little bit more. It says, Allegory of the seasons. As the sun appears to recede southward in autumn, the days in the northern hemisphere become shorter and cooler. Vegetation withers, fertility of the earth ceases. Sun stands lower in the sky. Its warmth and brightness are diminished. Allegorically speaking, the hours and powers of darkness are gradually winning over the powers of light. On December 22nd in the northern temperate latitudes, and it's important that you understand northern temperate latitudes because this event doesn't take place everywhere. And specifically, you didn't see these events a great deal of time take place in nomadic or pastoral societies, specifically agrarian or agricultural societies. That's why when even you think about Osiris, Osiris is the barley god, the wheat god, the corn god, you know, something to do with the whole process of the cycle of life, its resurrection, its growth, its death, and that cycle, you know, going around. It says that for weeks the sun has been growing weaker and weaker. Now is the culminating point, the shortest day of the year. On this day, the sun reaches its furthest point southward, which is south. In Babylonian mythology, this point represented the gates of the underworld, presided over by Nargal, the prince of darkness. Excuse me. In the Hercules myth, it represents the arrival of the sun at the Pillars of Hercules, which mark the end of his journey. As the sun sinks below the horizon on this day, the forces of darkness achieve their victory. But the supremacy of darkness is quickly challenged because the virgin goddess Virgo gives birth to a new sun, a new S-U-N, which replaces the dead god on the following day, and a new cycle begins. For about 3 days, the length of the day seems to remain unchanged. Then it gradually lengthens. This part I want you to listen to closely because this will identify the African origin in regard to the concept. The African origin in regard to the concept. The birth of the sun was first personified in Egypt by Horus, the god of light and the savior of the world. On the inner walls of the holies of holies in the temple of Luxor, for those of us who've been to Egypt know this already, the birth of Horus is pictured in a series of 4 scenes which are strikingly similar to the Christian representation of the Annunciation and the Immaculate Conception of Mary and the birth and adoration of Jesus. The temple was built by King Amenemhet III of the 17th dynasty about 16 centuries before Christ. In the first scene, Tat, or Tuuti, the scribe of the god, announces to the virgin that she will give birth to a son. In the second scene, Neph and the goddess Hathor holds Ankh crosses or keys of life to the head of the nostrils of the mother-to-be, and whose pregnancy is indicated by her swelling form. In the third scene, the mother is seated on the midwife's stool, and the newborn babe is held by attendants. In the fourth scene, the enthroned child is receiving homage from men and gods. The three figures behind Neph on the right are probably the three magi or kings of the legend. Each one holds gifts in the right hand and an Ankh cross in the left. I just want to know how familiar that story sounds.
Sounds like Christmas to me.
It says that in India during the Aries age, the passage of the sun into the sign of Capricorn was celebrated during the 12 days immediately following the winter solstice in honor of the Vedic sun Indra and Agni, with the addition later of the god Ganses. Presents were exchanged. Presents were exchanged. Cattle were led about with garlands. You know them things you hang on your door? Around their necks. All who could do so took all who could do so took purification baths in the sacred rivers, and generally rejoicing prevailed. At the present time, the sun enters the sign of Capricorn about January 15, which is the time of the festival of India in India, marking the lengthening of the days. Change. It says, because the date of Christ's birth was unknown, it was combined until about the year 354 with a baptismal feast which was celebrated January 6 in Rome on the date of the age, listen this, on the date of the age-old pagan festival. After the time of the birth was generally observed on December 25th, and the custom soon spread to the Eastern churches. But there was no official fixed date for the celebration of the Nativity by the Roman Church until about the year 530 AD, when at the request of the Pope, the Scythian monk Dionysius Erigus, a poet and astronomer, fixed the date on December 25th.
Which pope was that?
Excuse me? Oh, it didn't say which particular pope. But I guess if you would look up during that particular time period, you'll find out 530. This is also another one that I think we should take into consideration for those who might be Muslims. During the period shortly before after the birth of Christ, the dying god Dusaris, thank you. The dying god Dusaris, the only begotten of the Lord born of the virgin goddess Alat. Let me read that again. During the period shortly before and after the birth of the Christ, the dying god Dusaris, the only begotten of the Lord born of the virgin goddess Alat, A-L-L-A-T, feminine, A-L-L-A-H, masculine. It says that was worshipped by the Nabaeans in the Syrian cities of Petra, Bostra, and Adra. He was a god of fertility and was portrayed as a deity of the vine similar to the Greek god Bacchus. His birth was celebrated in December with games and festivals. Alat was pictured with a cornucopia which identified her as the goddess of fate and fortune. Like Athena, she wore on her head a mural crown with turreted walls which identified her as the protectress of cities. Now, the reason that I'm reading this is to just give you some insight into really how a lot of these materials and concepts and dogmas and stories in the Bible develop. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump from this story.
Wait, someone got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Before all the gods were considered masculine or male, were they not all
at one point in time for females and then...
Well, I always say read Merlin Stone's book, When God Was a Woman. And you'll find out that women always was exalted to the unique position of hierarchy because of their ability to not only give life, but they could sustain life. See, man didn't really know the significant role that he played in all of this. Because all he knew is that when a woman got pregnant, that eventually when she gave birth, that it was a little him or it was a little her. But he knew that he wasn't giving birth to nothing. So being just basically, respectful of that process, he put women in a woman in a very unique position of being God, because she not only could give life, she was equipped with all the characteristics to sustain life. So she became the most unique individual. We say Mother Earth, and listen to this, we say Father Time, but we say Mother Universe. Did y'all know that? Mother Universe. There's a picture right here on the front of this book where it shows Newton, the sky god with stars all over her body, symbolizing the universe. And if you've been to Egypt, you'll find it that in the temple of Dendera, that she goes from the bottom of the wall all the way up one side, all the way on across the ceilings and down on the other side. And you can see she is taken in the sun, the S-U-N in one mouth, and it comes out of her vagina in the other end. And it marks the 365 and a quarter days procession that it goes through. Is that correct, Brother Babasinda? This is in ancient Kemet. Yes.
1 second.
Like all your research that you study, before the Quran, before the Bible, was there ever like a certain religion or just like certain gods, or we really didn't praise gods and certain religions we just believe like in ourselves?
Well, that was partially true. I should say this, is that I think that we should stop trying to use a 1994 mindset and trying to transport it to what was going on back then. Because pretty much so, that's why in the Bible they say that it was a flood and the world was destroyed. Now what it really meant was pretty much, logically speaking, that it was probably their world and not the world. And when a group of people looked at the sum total of their existence, it was based on their geographical vicinity, their immediate surroundings. And if you notice that all their stories, creation, stories have their origin in the area in which they began. The Yoruba people say the origin of creation began in Yoruba land. The Dogon say that the god Amma began in their land. In Yoruba, I think it's Oludumare gave birth to Oduduwa. So you'll find the same thing in China. You'll find the same thing in Quetzalcoatl in Mexico. You'll find the same thing in every story in the world. And then eventually we begin to disperse, go outside of our geographical areas and pass on these concepts. The only reason that you even know Christianity today is because of the Roman Empire. Otherwise you wouldn't know nothing about it. It probably wouldn't even last 15 minutes. Because Constantine used it for a prop for the government in order to it to survive for a few years longer. It was actually on a decline. But that is correct. It had a lot to do with our geographical area. But I want to jump real quick because we don't got too much time and I don't want to waste your time.
Wait a minute, you got one more question back there, Ruby.
Brother Trust, in reference to women, in the Pharaoh dispensation, how many women did we have as Pharaoh?
How many women?
Yeah.
As bona fide
Pharaohs, yes.
Not too many. The only one that I know of is one. There was a lot of women that were in power-broking positions. And when we use the term pharaoh, we use it in all-encompassing, but I think that we missed the boat because we think that the guy ran the show. really it was the woman, the consort in which he got his power. He couldn't even sit on the throne if he didn't have a wife. The wife, which is the material lineage in which the line of power came through, that determined who he was. So much so, when you see Isis, Aset, her symbol, her Medu Neter symbol is a throne on her head. And she is the embodiment of the throne. When you see, look, see this picture? She is the throne that he sits on. Whenever you see Jesus, she's sitting there and he's sitting right on top of her. In her lap. So she really represents the root of power, not him. He just happens to be there to orchestrate what actually goes on.
And the Pope know that, huh?
Well, you know, the Pope, yeah. And if you notice, the Pope, here's a guy that they walk around in a chair in this throne. But in the southern region, in Nubia and in Meroe, you have quite a bit of women rulers, quite a bit of them, you know. And I suggest that you look that up, and you'll find in a lot of Nubian history, one of the books that you can read is by William Adams called Nubia, a Corridor of Africa, and it'll show you a line of women that was so bad it'll make your head do backflips. I mean, and women, you know, ruled quite different than men. And everybody knows the story of Hatshepsut. She ruled so great and, you know, filled the coffers of Egypt and developed the domestication of Egypt so strong that her brother and consort husband, Tutmosis III, was jealous. Because he felt that she wasn't fighting enough. You get that? She wasn't fighting enough. So,
As military example.
that's right. Because a lot of the acquired land in certain vicinities outside of Egypt began to relinquish back into the hands of the adversaries. So he decided to, you know, be the thrust to go out and recapture this land. And whether you know it or not, he made a concerted effort to erase her name, to defame her, to deface her. They don't know whether she died or he killed her. And don't you know that Tutmosis III is one of the great, they call him one of the greatest military strategists of all of Egyptian history. 17 major military campaigns, came back a winner. They said one of his greatest feats was he was able to win battles without one drop of sweat of blood. That's a feat, boy. But let me read this on.
All he had to do was just show up.
Just show up. They're running. I want to show you two quick stories. One, this is a story that I have. You can get a copy of it over there. Death is outwitted by gods, reborn in spring. This is out of the Financial Times, April 3rd, 1994. This is an economic newspaper. What do they call it, Robert? The economical jugular vein of the white boys, you know, system. Now what is this doing in there? Well, let me read this real quick before we go on to the story of Easter. Tomorrow, in thousands of Christian churches around the world, millions of men and women will celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They will rejoice in the words of the Apostle Creed, in the historical figure who was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. The third day, he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and sitteth at the right hand of the God, the Father Almighty. Tomorrow, children will open their Easter eggs, churches will be decked with flowers, and in some parts of Europe, bonfires will blaze. But we might choose to remember that far more than 2,000 years ago, long before the birth of Christ, and at almost precisely the same time of year, countless people celebrated the rebirth of their own particular God from death. They believed that there was not just one God, but many, or rather, many different names for the same one. In the Bronze Age, Sumeria, Around 2500 BC, they called him Dumuzi. In Babylonia, Tammuz. In ancient Egypt, Osiris. Later in Phrygia, and he was Attis. In Canaan, Baal. In Greece, Dionysus and Adonis. All of these gods died and descended into the underworld. A financial newspaper.
Let's go there.
So why is it there?
Well, I think they wanted to just give a different point of view and give some credence to concepts that might have had precedence over their already established holidays. Now, I don't mean better and I don't mean worse. I mean a parallel to those events. So we can read that. Also, if you want to read some material pertaining to the gods, pertaining to ancient other savior gods, there are two books you can read. Everybody knows about 16 Crucified Saviors by Kersey Graves. And here you have The World Saviors by C.H. Vail. And Vail goes into about 40 gods. Just give you a few. You got Jesus of Judea, Krishna, Gautama, Vitoba, Indra of India, Osiris, Horus, Thoth, and Hermes of Egypt, Zoroaster and Mithra of Persia, Tammuz and Adonis and Babylonia and Syria, Attis of Phrygia, Apollonius, Orpheus, Hercules, Bacchus, Artemis, Sander, Asclepius, Marius, Artis of Greece, Quetzalcoatl, and another individual of Mexico, Confucius and Ten, Loa Tzu and Yu of China, Muhammad of Arabia, Balder and Friar of Scandinavia, Prometheus and Augustus of Rome, Bacchab of Yucatan, Samhain of ancient Ireland, Mountcart of Tyre, Murdoch of Phoenicia, Bel Merodach of ancient Babylonia. And those are a few of the ancient savior gods that existed prior to Jesus. But let me just read this real quick about Easter, and I think you'll find it amusing. And remember, the main issue here is to look at the concept, its development, and also its African background. Easter, the most joyous, and let me just say this, I also have copies of this. This comes actually out of Encyclopedia Britannica. I mean, you know, you can find some information in there. And it says that the most joyous of Christian festivals observed annually throughout Christendom is commemoration of resurrection of Jesus Christ on the first Sunday after the full moon following the vernal equinox. Let me say that again. The commemoration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ of the first Sunday after the full moon following the vernal equinox. So here again, we're talking about this celestial event having a literal part to play even in this physical story. They haven't disposed one iota of it. They just changed the meaning. That's all they did. And I want you to also to take into consideration this event. Easter is the most celebrated event in all of Christianity. Not Christmas, Easter. Even though y'all think y'all get a lot on Christmas. And I just read an article that I took out of the Asbury Park Press about Easter being so commercial now. Remember, you know, buying clothes and chocolate and all of this kind of stuff. It's getting big business now, real big business. You know, because I'm pretty sure y'all know what the new clothes are for, right? Oh man, y'all slipping now. Let me read some of this. It says, though Easter Sunday is the central point in the observance of the events connected with the death and resurrection of Christ, the Easter season extends from Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent, to Whit Sunday, which commemorates the day of Pentecost. This period of Easter cycle may be divided into 4 periods. 1, the preparatory fast of the 40 days of Lent. 2, the 15 days beginning with the Sunday before the ending with the Sunday after Easter, during which the ceremonies of the Holy Week and the services of the octave of Easter are observed. And 3, the octave of Easter, during which the newly baptized wear their white garments. And 4, the Paschal season, beginning at Easter and lasting till Whit Sunday. Since the last days of Christ coincide with the Passover feast of the Jews, and his death fell upon the day of the feast of the Passover on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, it was naturally that the early Christians should associate the sacrifice of the true Lamb of God and the joyful promise of his resurrection with the traditional Passover observances, adding to the older festival the new idea of Christ as the sacrificial lamb. Now, I want to jump here. I also have a book over there on the history of the Jehovah Witness. And if you notice something about the Jehovah Witness, they don't celebrate Christmas, they don't wear crosses, and they don't have the same relationship with Jesus that a lot of us have. But you'll notice that they celebrate what is called Nisan 14.
Nisan what?
Nisan 14, what I just read to you. Remember, it says that the Jews, it says, since the last days of Christ coincide with the Passover feast, the Jews and his death fell upon the day of the feast, the Passover, on the 14th day of the month of Nisan. So the next time you see a Jehovah Witness, pop that one on him and see.
That is called Memorial Day.
Uh-oh. That's somebody who has an intimate relationship with Jehovah Witness. Oh, yeah. Well, I ain't going to say that because all of y'all have an intimate relationship, because everybody remember this. Watch now. You know, y'all remember that. Let me read on. It says that where did I stop? It says that, and should celebrate traditional Passover observances, adding to the older festival of the new idea of Christ as the sacrificial lamb, and should celebrate the old and the new feasts at the same time. Since the Jewish calendar consists of 12 lunar months, or 354 days, which periodically an extra month inserted to bring it in line with the solar calendar. See here? It says that the date of the new Christian festival, like that of Passover, shifted from one year to another in relationship to the Julian calendar, then used by the Romans, which was calculated according to the solar year. Thus, Easter has remained a movable date, filling or falling anywhere between March 22nd and April 25th, and has determined the date of all the events falling within the Easter cycle. Easter customs. This is what you want to hear. It says the close association of Easter with the Jewish Passover or Pasek is indicated by the fact that among the non-Teutonic peoples, the name for this holy day is derived from the same root as the Hebrew word Pasek, Latin fies or Fiesta, Pascalia, French, Pasques. The English word Easter, however, corresponds to the German Oster, or Oster, O-S-T-E-R, reveals Christians' indebtedness to the Teutonic tribes of Central Europe. Christianity, when it reached the Teutons, incorporated in the celebration of the great Christian feast day many of the heathen rites and customs which accompanied their observance of the spring festival. That the festival of the resurrection occurred in the spring, that it celebrated the triumph of life over death, light over darkness, that made it easy for the church to identify with the occasion, the most joyful or the most joyous festival of the Teutons held in honor of the death of winter and the birth of the new year and the return of the sun. It says Eostur month, E-O-S-T-U-R month, or Easter month, corresponds to our month of April, and according to Bede, dedicated to Eostro, or Astra, goddess of spring, gave its name to the Christian holy holiday. If you look up the word Easter in the Bible, in the dictionary, it will say that it had its origin, from the goddess of spring called Eostro, which was the goddess of the brand new dawn. The brand new dawn. It says the customs and symbols associated with the observances of Easter have ancient origins, not only in Teutonic rites of spring, but also far back in antiquity. The practice of eating eggs on Easter Sunday and of giving them as gifts to friends or to children probably arose because in the early days of the church, eggs were forbidden for food during Lent and were therefore always eaten Easter Sunday. That means while you fasted, you couldn't eat eggs. They wouldn't allow it. So I guess this was one of the major, food staples that a lot of individuals ate. So one of the first things they ate was eggs. But let's move on a little further. It says, but the connection of the eggs as a symbol of fertility and a renewed life goes back to the ancient Egyptians. It says, and Persians, who had also the customs of coloring and eating eggs during their spring festival. Now let me add a little something else here. During this whole process, the coloring of eggs, they were significantly signifying the sun. That's why the eggs were either red or yellow, pretty bright colors. And they would paint these eggs, and the reason that they use eggs is because eggs, again, are symbols of fertility. Like bunny rabbits are symbols of fertility. Don't you know, we talked about the virgin mother goddesses. Well, in ancient Europe, you'll find out that they didn't paint Easter eggs. They painted women. And women would run out in the forest, and we would hunt women. That's where the Easter egg came from. And if you cut the woman, you could engage in copulation with that woman as a sacred religious event. Now don't get lustful here. It's a sacred religious event. And that's where this whole concept of Easter egg hunt came from. Let me move on. It says this ancient idea of significance of the egg as a symbol of new life readily became the idea of the egg as a symbol of resurrection as it came to be interpreted by the Christians. The color red used in dyeing the eggs has been voraciously interpreted as signifying the sun, fire, and the blood of Christ shed on Calvary and the joy of Easter. In many places, Easter games played with eggs were traditionally, and the annual egg rolling held on the lawn of the White House in Washington, D.C. is a modern reminder of these old pagan sports. Like the Easter egg, the Easter hare, now an accepted part of the traditional Easter story, came to Christianity from antiquity. The hare is associated with the moon in the legend of an ancient Egyptian people. It belongs to the night. We're talking about the hare. It belongs to the night, since it comes out only then to feed. It is born with its eyes open, and like the moon is the open-eye watcher of the skies. Remember this bunny rabbit, that's an Egyptian thing. Now, Baba Sinda also tell you in regard to fables and storytelling, Brer Rabbit and all of these is African stories. But let me move on. It says, through the fact that the Egyptian word, listen to this, through the fact that the Egyptian word for hair, un, means also open.
Open?
Open. Like to open. Like open eyes. Like the moon watching you. It says, and period, the hair came to be associated with the idea of periodicity, both lunar and human, and with the beginning of the new life in both the young man and the young woman, and so a symbol of fertility and of the renewal of life. As such, the hair became linked with the Easter or Paschal eggs. You hear what I said? Paschal eggs. I didn't say Paschal what? No, Paschal lamb. Remember, you think of Paschal lamb. Here you got Paschal eggs. Prior to the lamb. Now remember, this has a lot to do with celestial evolvement. As the zodiac sign began to take over, in the sign of Aries, do we start using the lamb. And you'll find out that as the zodiacs change, they use different symbols. In the United States, where the hair is unfamiliar, it is the Easter rabbit which is fabled to lay the eggs. It is the Easter rabbit which is fabled to lay the eggs in the nest prepared for it, or to hide them for the little children to find. Now, I know that y'all, I mean, when y'all was young, y'all might not have thought about it, but didn't you think something kind of funny with a little basket with green grass? Think about this, green grass, a rabbit, and eggs. What's the connection here? I didn't see no chickens nowhere, but I seen rabbits. So now you begin to see the connection, how these things became part and parcel of what is called, in this book they use them as procreational or sex worship. I don't like to use that. I use the word sex veneration. Sex veneration, because we've seen the sacredness in sex and use it as a symbol, as a reminder that we always carry with us to acknowledge the greatness of procreation. So you wanted to deal with that. But let me move on, because you're going to find some other things that are quite funny. Various other customs and traditions are associated with Easter, many of them surviving into the 20th century, especially in more remote places. According to old superstitions, the sun rising on Easter morning dances in the heavens. This belief has been traced to the old heathen festival of spring, when the spectators, and you notice how they use these words, heathen and pagan, and it says, when the spectators danced in honor of the sun, the exchange of the Easter kiss was a ceremonious and joyful Easter rite. The Easter greeting, Christ is risen, as answered by He is risen indeed, was universally familiar in Russia until the time of the revolution, which meant when the communists came in, it went out. The tradition, and you'll find out that in that article that I had in the Financial Times, they'll tell you that concept, the Christ has risen, is an old concept that came from Osiris, from Aset, which is Osiris has risen. And that's where they got it from. It says that the tradition that new fires should be started on Easter, lighted by the friction of wood or of flint and steel, goes back to the Teutonic superstition. According to the belief held in many places, it was unlucky not to wear some new article of clothing or personal adornment on Easter. The modern custom, seemingly entirely worldly, of appearing in a new costume on Easter Sunday may go back to this belief. You see? It's the changing of environment, and you change. It was like the throwing out of the old and the bringing in of the new. You heard the expression spring cleaning? Well, this is what they're talking about. It says that as those families oh, this is one you'll find quite funny. As those families who by custom eat ham on Easter Sunday are unwittingly following an old practice of the Roman Catholics of England, who ate a gammon of bacon on Easter to show their contempt for their Jewish friends to whom pork was forbidden. But I'm going to skip one part and just go to the fixed dates, because a lot of this other stuff you don't really need in here. But this little part I really want to read, and it's involving the dates of these events, and it has a lot to do with the celestial events, and that's why it got really confused. Fixing date for celebrating Easter. Confusion early arose as the proper date of the observance of Easter. According to the Gospel, Jesus celebrated the Passover on Thursday, whereas the priesthood observed it on Friday, the day of the crucifixion. When the church appointed Easter as the holy day, a sharp controversy ensued as to whether it should be celebrated on the 14th or the 15th of the month. The disputants, being respectively called the Quatrodecimians and the Quatrodecimans, it is uncertain, in fact, as to whether the early Easter festivals commemorated the crucifixion of Christ, the resurrection, or both. Early in the history of the church, a dispute arose between the Jewish and the Gentile Christians. The Jews linked the festival with the death of the resurrection of Christ, with the traditional Jewish feast of the Passover, maintained that Easter should be observed like Pasch on the 14th of Nisan, regardless of the day of the week upon which it fell. On the other hand, the Christians of the Gentile descent insisted that the holy day be observed on Sunday, since it was on that day of the week that the resurrection had occurred, and that the date of the crucifixion be observed on the preceding Friday. This dispute persisted into the 4th century. The Western Church generally celebrated Easter on Sunday, and the Eastern Church following the Church traditionally. And what they mean is the Latin Western Church, which is the Church of Rome, and then the Eastern Church, which is the Church of the Byzantine Empire, or the Greek Orthodox, actually celebrated these particular events at different times. Remember, Constantine took the Roman Catholic Church, or should I say his part of the Roman government, to a place called Constantinople, which is modern-day Turkey, which is Istanbul. That was Constantinople. There he set up this theocracy, which was called the Byzantine Empire, which is the longest reigning white European government in history. Did y'all know that? Over 1,000 years this government ruled. It is called the Byzantine Empire. And they actually had disputes as early as, I would say, the 4th century all the way up into the 10th century, or the 11th century. But what happened was that disputes were over major things like whether Jesus was God, whether he was unbegotten of the unbegotten, whether Jesus was the same substance of what his father was. You know, because to them, the Eastern Orthodox community were heavily influenced by the geography in which they was. So they were close to Islam, and they were close to the Jews over in that area, whereas the Romans, they wasn't having it. They wasn't even hearing that, you know. So in the Rome, you had the access to really, you know, do just about anything, and they were into worshiping concepts and icons and things like that, that actually what separated them, what was called iconoclasts. Now, iconoclasts was those individuals who actually, you know, did not worship, you know, icons or pictures or murals. In Rome, they worshiped murals. This is where you get the worship of the Virgin Mary. And I see, you know, the Virgin Mary there, and everybody come praying. That's a Roman thing. The Greek Orthodox will never engage in that. You never see no Greek Orthodox engage in anything like that. That's a Roman thing. And this actually what split the church in half. It originally, formally, was split in 1054 with Pope Leo the Ninth and Patriarch Michael Shelathios, who actually excommunicated each other from the church. That's right, they canceled each other out. You ain't no good, you ain't no good, I'm gonna do my thing, I'm gonna do my thing. So the Roman became the Latin church, and the Eastern church became the Greek church. And that's why you have so much controversy even still today, because of it. But this identified what that is in regard to the changing of the calendars. And what I'll do is that I have some copies over here. You can, take some of this material with you. Let me just make one statement in regard to Good Friday. Anybody know about Good Friday? Dr. Ben used to say, they used to ask him, well, why do they call it Good Friday? And Dr. Ben said, well, I guess it was because he was a black man and they killed him, and a good nigga is a dead nigga. But in the Encyclopedia Britannica, they have something a little different. And that is that they said that the name of Good Friday before Easter kept as the anniversary of the crucifixion. Don't touch that. In regard to the crucifixion, the term is probably a corruption. Good Friday is probably a corruption of God's Friday. It was called Long Friday by Anglo-Saxons and Danes, probably in allusion to the length of the services which marked the day. The origin of the customs of a really commemoration of the crucifixion is somewhat obscure. But that was the day Jesus died, and the church, and a lot of the church, if you notice, in certain churches they would dress up in black, the altar would be black, they pull the drapes down or close it out, and everything would be bare. And then, on Sunday, what would happen? No. If you dress on black, is the day of mourning. On Sunday, which is the new what? Day of what? Light. So you dress up in what? White. You get it? So those became, partial parts of the situation. So what I'm going to do now is that since we get kind of late.
Hold on. 1 second, Charles. We going back.
Bible, just a short book. But while I was in Canada, I happened to run across a sister. I was doing a lecture at a sister's house that I was staying with. She said, well, I got an article I want you to check out. And I said, wow, what is it about? She said, well, it's about Jesus. And I said, is it good? She said, based on what you said, you will like it. This actually comes out of the Toronto Star, Saturday, November 13th. Did Jesus really give us the Lord's Prayer? The Venerable Bede. Ancient theologians may have altered some of the Bible in translation. It says, what did Jesus really say? Less than 20% of what is ascribed to him in the Gospels according to the California-based seminar. And what that sentence right there says is that based on the material that is attributed to Jesus, less than 20% or over 80% is not true. Let me read on. It says the conclusion was reached after Jesus' seminar followers, representing biblical scholars from a wide array of Western religious traditions and academic institutions, inventoried all of the surviving ancient texts for words attributed to Jesus. They then studied, debated, and finally voted on each of the more than 1,500 documents. 1,500 sayings of Jesus in the inventory. The result is the 5 Gospels, the search for the authentic words of Christ. And I happen to have the book home. And it's quite a thick, and they had theological scholars, seminary scholars, comparative religion scholars, but most of all, they didn't just come up and say, okay, this is blasphemy, this isn't. What they did was they began to debate and to toy with the issue, what would be accepted and what didn't. But I thought the percentage was the deepest, outgrowth of this whole study. And that is that more than 80% of all the material that was attributed to Jesus was either not true or distorted. So what that identifies also again is that next time I'll go into a little bit more, I would say, historical material pertaining to the historicity of the Bible, its compilation in regard to the anonymous writers and the schismatic controversies that went on and the early parts of the church and why we end up with all these denominational differences and things like that will give you a more meat and potatoes in regard to that area. But what I want to do is I just want to thank everybody for bearing with me, and sometimes these things are tedious, but most of all, if you really want to go home with the material and with the material correctly, what you really want to take into consideration is that you have did your homework. I also did not forget that I got a 5-question test. 5 questions, and I'm going to ask y'all right now before you go.
Go ahead.
The first question, and if you was listening carefully, you should know the answer. What was the major book that I read from? What was the name of it?
Sex and symbol.
Symbol, sex, and star.
By who? The next question, by who?
Who?
Worldly, something like that.
No. Say the name again. Sex, signs, and symbols?
Symbol, sex, and star.
That's correct. And the next one was who wrote it? I guess no. Say that again. Busenbach. That's correct. Ernest Busenbach.
With a B, right?
That's right. Busenbach. What chapter did I read from? 7. Oh, right. And what was the name of the chapter? The death and the rebirth of the Son.
Right.
Remember that? Now, these are just basic. I'm just giving. Oh yeah, that's right. One more. This one is real easy. Y'all should all get this one right with no problem.
You're drinking water.
Y'all should all get this one easy. Who started this program off today?
James.
See, they got one right, James. But I want to thank you, and I hope you have me back again. And you can do this.